the first question I answered was, what is a correlation research design? So correlation research kind of gives you the chance to predict things and explain, like, is there a potential relationship between these various different things? People normally use a correlation statistical test to describe and measure the relationship. So even if something is related, this kind of helps you to know how related they are, and that's called the degree of association. The investigators don't try to control or change the variables. Instead, they use the correlation statistic to relate those two variables. What are the ethical concerns in conducting correlational research? So there are lots of different ethical concerns and issues that I saw when I researched this in our textbook. I just listed a few here. It is unethical to not have measured appropriate controls. So the things that you choose to use, like age, gender, race, making sure that those things are appropriate. It's also unethical if the sample size isn't sufficient enough for adequate power and to meet the assumptions in specific tests that are used in the study. So your sample size can't be too small or too large. It needs to be sufficient to test what you're trying to do in your study. It's also unethical to make up or edit the data. It's also unethical to make up or edit data because you want your study to be as close to what you got as possible. So you don't want to change your data or make it up to make it fit your hypothesis. It's also unethical to remove an outlier from the data set, so something that's really high or really low or very out of the norm, unless you have a clear rationale or reason for removing it. And you also have to be transparent about that as the research person. And finally, researchers should not plagiarize the words of others. They shouldn't fail to report contradictory findings, so you shouldn't leave things out just because they don't go with your hypothesis. You shouldn't publish the same evidence many different times, and you definitely don't want to omit or leave out negative findings or alternate explanations just because they don't fit with what you thought was going to happen. So what are the steps in conducting a correlational study? Step 1, so the very first thing you're going to do is you're going to determine if a correlational study best addresses your research problem. Step 2, you're going to identify individuals to study. Step 3, you're going to identify 2 or more measures for each individual in the study. And then step 4, you're going to collect the data and monitor potential threats. Step 5, you're going to analyze the data and represent the results. And step 6, you're going to interpret the results.
What are the degree and strength of association? Degree of association means that the association between two variables or sets of scores and a correlation coefficient of -1 to +1, with 0 indicating no linear association at all. This shows whether there is an association between the scores. The strength depends on the size of the number. 2/10 to 35/100 is low. 35/100 to 65/100 is limited. 66/100 to 85/100 is good. And 86/100 and above is high. What is path analysis and how do we use it in correlation research? Path analysis is a statistical procedure for looking at the likely causal relationship among 3 or more variables that influence an outcome. You are looking for the correlation among variables. Using correlation analysis, we can determine what factors have a direct influence on the outcome and which ones are mediated by other variables. What is hierarchical linear modeling analysis, and how do we use it in correlation research? Hierarchical linear models provide an advanced approach to linear regression and a conceptual and statistical approach for investigating and drawing conclusions regarding the influence of phenomena at different levels of analysis. These models are used when there are different units of analysis at different levels. This enables researchers to compare the variations within each level with the variations among the different levels in terms of outcome variables. How do you evaluate a correlational study? To have a higher quality correlational study, the researcher has at least 30 participants, displays a complete correlation matrix correlating all of the variables, selects the proper statistic based on the types of scales being used to measure the variables in a study, reports on the relationship between the variables, provides at least the p-values, the effect size, and the confidence intervals in reporting the correlational analyses, identifies both the predictor and criterion variables, uses a visual model to show the predicted direction of data based on the observed data.
What is the explanatory design? An explanatory research design is a correlational design in which the researcher is interested in the extent to which two or more variables covary, which means changes in one variable are reflected in changes in the other. Explanatory designs consist of a simple association between two or more variables. Characteristics of explanatory research designs. The investigators correlate two or more variables. The researcher collects data at one point in time. The investigator analyzes all participants in a single group. The researcher obtains at least 2 scores for each individual in the group. The researcher reports the use of the correlation statistical test in the data analysis. The researcher draws conclusions from the test results. What is the prediction design? In a prediction design, researchers anticipate outcomes by using certain variables as predictors. The purpose of a prediction research design is to identify variables that will predict an outcome. A predictor variable is a variable used to make a forecast about an outcome in correlational research. Investigators often use more than one predictor variable. The outcome being predicted is called the criterion variable. Characteristics of a prediction study. The authors typically use the word prediction in the title. The researchers typically measure the predictor variable or variables at one point in time and the criterion variable at a later point in time. The authors forecast future performance. A prediction study will report correlations using the correlation statistical test, but it may include advanced statistical procedures. For example, the author may be interested in several predictors that help explain the criterion. How did correlational research develop? The correlational statistical test and the procedures for using and interpreting it contribute to the history of correlational research. Procedures for calculating the correlation statistics were first developed in the late 19th century. Carl Pearson presented the correlation formula we know today in November 1895. Pearson not only focused on the formula for a correlation, but also presented concepts familiar to quantitative researchers today, such as the importance of sample size, the value of precise measurement, and the use of unbiased samples. By 1904, Spearman published ideas about a correlation matrix to display the coefficients, and he advanced a formula for data that did not fit a normal bell-shaped distribution. Numerous factors contributed to quantitative researchers utilizing correlational studies during the 1970s and 1980s. These include the invention of the computer, a better understanding of measurement scales, and the demand to study relationships between many variables. Researchers today test complicated models with many variables. When do you use correlational research? Researchers use correlational design when they seek to relate two or more variables to see if they are associated with each other. This design allows you to predict an outcome and is also useful in assessment and testing research. Researchers also use this design when they know and can apply statistical knowledge based on calculating the correlation statistical test.
What are the key concepts of correlational design? Direction, form, strength, scatter plots, matrices, partial correlations, multiple regressions. What is meta-analysis? Meta-analysis is a quantitative set of techniques used analyzing data from a number of different studies that are based on the same or similar issues to determine the overall trends. The purpose of the meta-analysis is to understand the data as a single study and the content of all studies on the subject. There are 6 steps in conducting a meta-analysis: problem formulation, searching databases, gathering studies, criteria for review, effective size, summary effect, and interpretation. Meta-analysis is used in various fields such as medical, psychology, criminology, business, and education. A factor analysis looks at the moderately or high correlated variables and reduce these variables into smaller sets of variables for regression analysis. The goal is to look for a cluster of variables that are highly correlated and have low correlation with each other variables. The purpose of using factor analysis is correlated research is to look for a number of variables that are highly correlated and have low correlation with other variables in a study. Variables that correlate may be combined into one variable. Therefore, the number of variables is reduced. What is discriminate functional analysis and how do we use it in correlation research? Discriminate analysis is a statistical procedure used by researchers to determine the differences between two or more categories. Researchers find out which factors are highly important based on their functional discriminated score.
And this is our references page, and that's the end.